Imagine being alone in the vast wilderness of Alaska, with nothing but the clothes on your back. One moment, you're paddling through icy waters, and the next, your world flips upside down. Literally, my boat overturned in a freezing river, taking everything with it, my gear, my food, and my hope of making it out before winter sets in. What would you do? Most people would panic, but in that split second, I knew I had to survive. With nothing but the tools nature provided, I faced the harshest winter imaginable, building a shelter from scratch, crafting tools, and fighting off hunger day by day. This is a true story of survival, and if you think you've seen it all, trust me, you haven't. Stay with me as I share every gritty detail of how I made it out alive. This isn't just another survival tale, it's one that will make you question if you could survive in the wild too. It was late autumn, and the Alaskan wilderness was already biting with cold. I had been out on a fishing trip, navigating through the narrow rivers in a small wooden boat, planning to return to base camp by sunset. The sky was a dull gray, threatening snow, but I wasn't concerned. I'd been in the wild plenty of times before, but little did I know, this time would be different. As I paddled along, the river current picked up speed. Out of nowhere, a hidden rock snagged my boat, flipping it in an instant. The cold hit me like a brick, and my heart raced as I struggled to keep my head above water. The icy current dragged me down, but I fought my way back to the surface. By the time I scrambled onto the shore, the boat, and everything in it, was gone. I stood there, soaked and freezing, with nothing but the clothes on my back. My jacket, now heavy with water, clung to me, and my boots sloshed with each step. I knew I had to act fast. The temperature was dropping, and the snow would come any day. Without proper shelter and food, I wouldn't last long. I had no tent, no tools, and no supplies. My first thought was shelter. I needed something to keep the wind and cold at bay, at least until I could figure out a long-term solution. I walked along the tree line, scanning for materials. A dense thicket of spruce trees caught my eye. The branches would provide insulation, and I could use the wood to build a basic lean-to. With nothing but my bare hands, I began breaking off branches and stacking them into a makeshift wall. It was slow, hard work, especially as the cold numbed my fingers. But after a few hours, I had something that resembled a shelter, not much, but it would keep the wind off my back for the night. That night was one of the longest of my life. The cold was relentless, and even though I'd managed to stay dry, I could feel my body temperature dropping. I didn't sleep, too afraid that if I closed my eyes, I might not wake up. The next morning, with my energy sapped from the cold, I knew I needed something more substantial if I was going to survive the coming weeks. A simple lean-to wouldn't cut it. I decided to build a more permanent structure, a log cabin of sorts. I didn't have an axe, but I did have persistence. I gathered fallen logs, rolling them into place to form a small square base. It took days to find enough logs and build something that resembled a cabin. Each day, my fingers grew more calloused, but I could feel my survival instincts kicking in. The shelter was only the beginning. I needed warmth. I remembered from my survival training that you could make a stove using clay and stones. So, I started digging. The earth was tough and frozen in places, but I chipped away, gathering enough clay to mold a rough stove. I stacked stones inside to retain heat and found a few large, flat rocks to act as a chimney of sorts. The first time I lit a fire in that makeshift stove, the relief was indescribable. For the first time in days, I felt warmth creeping back into my bones. The stove wasn't perfect, but it worked, and it became my lifeline through the cold Alaskan nights. With shelter and fire sorted, my next challenge was food. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the hunger was beginning to gnaw at me. The river was my best bet for a meal. Even though my fishing gear was lost in the wreck, I knew I could still catch fish with my bare hands or by crafting a primitive trap. I gathered some branches and wove them into a rudimentary fish trap, setting it in a narrow part of the river where the fish would have to pass through. Then, I waited. After a few hours, I checked the trap, and to my relief, I found a couple of small fish wriggling inside. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. I cooked the fish over the fire, savoring every bite, knowing I had to ration what little food I could catch. But fish alone wouldn't sustain me for long. I needed meat, and that meant hunting. Without a rifle or bow, I had to rely on more primitive methods. I decided to set up snares, simple loops of wire I could make from vines and branches. I placed them along game trails, hoping to catch rabbits or any small animals that wandered through. Days passed, and finally, one morning, I found a rabbit struggling in one of my snares. It was a hard thing to do, but survival leaves little room for sentiment. I skinned and cooked the rabbit, grateful for the nourishment. Over the next few weeks, I caught a few more rabbits and even managed to trap a small deer using a more complex snare system I'd set up near a clearing. As the weeks turned into months, the snow piled higher, and the temperatures plummeted. I was alone in the wilderness, but I had adapted to my new reality. My log cabin had become a true home, with a sturdy roof, a clay stove that provided enough heat, and a small stockpile of dried fish and meat. Winter was relentless, but I fought back with every fiber of my being. I learned to read the land, following animal tracks in the snow to set my traps. I made use of every resource nature provided, from boiling tree bark for nutrients to using snow to melt for water. The nights were the hardest. Alone in the pitch black of the Alaskan wilderness, with the howling wind outside, I often wondered if I would make it to spring. But each morning, I forced myself to get up, tend to the fire, check my snares, and prepare for another day. Finally, after months of isolation and survival, the snow began to melt, and I knew I had made it. The spring thaw brought with it a sense of relief, and I knew it was time to make my way back to civilization. I walked out of that wilderness a different person. I had faced nature's toughest tests and emerged stronger. Surviving in the wild had taught me one thing: when the odds are against you, never give up. If you were as gripped by this story as I was living it, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We've got even more incredible tales of survival and adventure coming your way. And don't forget to drop a comment below. What would you do in a situation like this? Stay tuned for more, and thanks for watching.